Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Friday, July 7th, 2023. Pentagon announces a new $800 million military aid package for Ukraine to help its fight against the Russian military occupying parts of eastern Ukraine, and the package includes controversial cluster munitions. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg previewing next week's NATO leaders' summit and what language will emerge on how soon Ukraine may become a member of the military alliance. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen meets with China's number 2 leader, the premier, to discuss trade relations and tensions. Secretary Yellen urging China not to let disagreements over U.S. limits on technology exports hurt economic cooperation between the countries. U.S. jobs report from the Labor Department, U.S. adding 209,000 jobs in June, lower than many estimates. The unemployment rate falls from 3.7% to 3.6%. President Biden calling it Bidenomics in action. Plus, Republican presidential candidates Donald Trump in Iowa and Doug Burgum in New Hampshire, and Casey DeSantis, the wife of candidate Ron DeSantis, in Iowa. That and more coming up on Washington Today. We begin with the new $800 million aid package for Ukraine, including Bradley and Stryker armored vehicles and cluster munitions, which Fox News reports release smaller bomblets designed to kill personnel and destroy vehicles. One cluster munition or canister can carry tens to hundreds of these smaller bomblets. They are controversial because the small bomblets target a wide area, and once the shrapnel from the bomblets is released, does not have a specific target, posing potential threats to civilians and civilian infrastructure. Unexploded bomblets could even kill civilians long after they are released. That from Fox News. The Defense Undersecretary for Policy, Colin Kahl, spoke in the Pentagon briefing room.
Some of the capabilities in today's $800 million drawdown package include 155 millimeter artillery rounds, including dual-purpose improved conventional munitions, or DPICMs, and 105 millimeter artillery rounds. Additional munitions for Patriot air defense systems and ammunition for high-mobility artillery rocket systems, or HIMARS. Additional Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, additional Stryker armored personnel carriers, precision aerial munitions, demolition munitions and systems for obstacle clearing, and various spare parts and operational sustainment equipment. With this announcement, we will be able to provide Ukraine with hundreds of thousands of additional artillery ammunition immediately. This decision will ensure we can sustain our support for Ukraine by bridging us to a point where we are producing sufficient artillery ammunition on a monthly basis across the coalition. We recognize the complexities here, which is why I want to quickly provide a few additional pieces of information on DPICM. First, Russia has been using cluster munitions indiscriminately since the start of this war in order to attack Ukraine. By contrast, Ukraine is seeking DPICM rounds in order to defend its own sovereign territory. Second, compared to Russian cluster munitions, the DPICM rounds we will provide Ukraine have an extremely low failure or dud rate. The DPICM ammunition we are delivering to Ukraine will consist only of those with a dud rate less than 2.35%. Compare that to Russia, which has been using cluster munitions across Ukraine with dud rates of between 30 and 40%. During the first year of the conflict alone, Russia fired cluster munitions deployed from a range of weapon systems have likely expended tens of millions of submunitions or bomblets across Ukraine. Third, we're working with Ukraine to minimize the risks associated with the decision. The Ukrainian government has offered us assurances in writing on the responsible use of DPICMs, including that they will not use the rounds in civilian-populated urban environments, and that they will record where they use these rounds, which will simplify later demining efforts. Ukraine also has committed to post-conflict demining efforts to mitigate any potential harm to civilians. The United States has already invested more than $95 million in Ukraine's demining activities, and we will provide more support to help Ukraine mitigate the impacts of cluster munition use by both sides in this conflict. And fourth, and this is critical, by providing Ukraine with DPICM artillery ammunition, we will ensure that the Ukrainian military has sufficient artillery ammunition for many months to come. In this period, the United States, our allies and partners, will continue to ramp up our defense industrial bases to support Ukraine. For the past year and a half, President Biden has been clear that we will support Ukraine for as long as it takes.
Colin Kahl, Defense Undersecretary for Policy, with reporters at the Pentagon. More from the Fox News article, a convention banning the use of cluster bombs has been joined by more than 120 countries who agreed not to use, produce, transfer, or stockpile the weapons and to clear them after they've been used. The United States, Russia, and Ukraine are among the countries that have not signed on. At the White House, this from the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan.
What convinced President Biden this was the right time to do cluster munitions, given the concerns? Did allies express concerns to him? And are you suggesting that the reason you're providing cluster munitions is because Ukraine is running out of unitary artillery rounds? Is it the backfill that?
So first, we have been looking at this for quite some time. And what we have been weighing is this basic question of civilian harm. The challenge of cluster munitions, as you know, is that even at low dud rates, there are some unexploded ordnance that is left, and that could potentially pose a risk to civilians down the road. So we did not immediately come out of the gate and provide this. But we had to balance that against the risk to civilian harm if Ukraine did not have sufficient artillery ammunition. We are reaching a point in this conflict because of the dramatically high expenditure rates of artillery by Ukraine and by Russia, where we need to build a bridge from where we are today to when we have enough monthly production of unitary rounds, that unitary rounds alone will suffice to give Ukraine what it needs. So as a result, this is the moment to begin the construction of that bridge so that there isn't any period over this summer or heading into this fall when Ukraine is short on artillery, and being short on artillery, it is vulnerable to Russian counterattacks that could subjugate more Ukrainian civilians. That is the thinking behind our decision. We consulted closely with allies in deciding to do this, and some allies who are not signatories to the Oslo Convention embraced it with open arms, said this is absolutely the right thing to do. Even allies who were signatories to the Oslo Convention, while they cannot formally support something that they've signed up to a convention against, have indicated both privately and many of them publicly over the course of today that they understand our decision, and fundamentally that they recognize the difference between Russia using its cluster munitions to attack Ukraine and Ukraine using cluster munitions to defend itself, its citizens, and its sovereign territory. So we feel that this will in no way disrupt the very strong, firm unity that we have heading into the NATO summit in Vilnius next week.
National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan at the White House. President Biden was asked why the cluster munitions were being sent now. He took that question at the end of an unrelated event at the White House.
President, cluster munitions, why now?
We've run out of ammunition.
President Biden at the White House. Senator Tom Cotton, Republican from Arkansas, tweeting his support for Ukrainian forces. He writes, to defeat Putin's invasion, Ukraine needs at least equal access to the weapons Russia already uses against them, like cluster munitions. Providing this new capability is the right decision, even if it took too long, and is one I've supported. Congresswoman Barbara Lee, Democrat from California, tweeting her opposition. Cluster bombs, she writes, work by scattering tiny bomblets over a wide area. Many of these bomblets don't explode, but remain a threat to civilians for decades. That's why dozens of organizations wrote to President Biden last month, warning him about the harm these bombs pose. Back to the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. He was also asked today about what Russia said earlier this week, that it was open to a possible prisoner exchange that could involve Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who is being held in a Russian prison on charges of espionage.
Today is the 100th day of Evan's unjust and unlawful detention. And for those 100 days, President Biden, the entire national security team, our embassy in Moscow, our Secretary of State, myself personally have been invested in trying to bring him home safely. Second, I had the opportunity this morning to meet with Evan's employers at the Wall Street Journal and the personal representatives of his family to talk about the latest status in his case and our efforts to bring Evan home. Third, we did see the comments from the Kremlin that there have been contacts between the U.S. and Russia regarding Evan and other unjustly detained Americans. It is true, and we have said that we remain in contact with Russian authorities at high levels on these cases to try to figure out a way to bring unjustly detained Americans home, including Evan. We have also made clear for months now, even before Evan was detained, as we were dealing with Paul Whelan, that we are prepared to do hard things in order to get our citizens home, including getting Evan home. I do not want to give false hope. What the Kremlin said earlier this week is correct. There have been discussions, but those discussions have not produced a clear pathway to a resolution. And so I cannot stand here today and tell you that we have a clear answer to how we are going to get Evan home. All I can do is tell you that we have a clear commitment and conviction that we will do everything possible to bring him home.
White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. From Associated Press, NATO leaders will agree next week to help modernize Ukraine's armed forces, create a new high-level forum for consultations, and reaffirm that it will join their alliance one day, the organization's top civilian official said Friday. But the war-torn country will not start membership talks soon. They also hope to welcome Sweden as the next member of the world's biggest security organization if they can overcome the Turkish president's objections, even though its accession would only be made official in coming months. Associated Press with that news article. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg held his news conference at NATO headquarters in Brussels, Belgium. He was asked about what will come out of the meeting concerning Ukraine's future membership in NATO. The reporter references the declaration from a 2008 NATO summit.
Mindaugas Laukagalis from Lithuania National Radio and Television. Thank you for this opportunity. I have two questions. The first one is, Ukraine is calling 2008 Bucharest Declaration a historic mistake. How Vilnius Declaration will be different from that? Because in 2008, the leaders said that Ukraine will become a NATO member, and it seems that you're going to repeat this in 2023. So what's the difference? And the other question is, have you heard something from President Zelensky? Will he participate in the summit? Thank you.
There are many differences. One important difference is, of course, that Ukraine has come much closer to NATO because NATO allies have worked closely with Ukraine for many years, especially since 2014. So this has ensured a much higher level of cooperation and interoperability between Ukraine and NATO. And we will also, I expect also that leaders, when they meet in Vilnius, they will also agree a package that will help to move Ukraine even closer to NATO, partly by establishing the NATO-Ukraine Council, which is a political platform where we can have crisis consultations and also actually make decisions together and deepen our political cooperation. The practical support, and not least the multi-year program, also has a clear political dimension, because by agreeing to stand by Ukraine and also help them for the longer term and to ensure full interoperability with NATO, we are helping Ukraine to come even closer to NATO and NATO membership. And then finally, I am confident that we'll find a united way also to address the specific issue on membership, but I will not go into the details of exact language now, because that is something we will announce when everything is in place by the summit. I look forward to welcoming President Zelensky at the summit and to have him taking part in the first or the inaugural meeting of the NATO-Ukraine Council.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, news conference at NATO headquarters in Brussels. AP also writing, in 2014, NATO allies pledged to move towards spending 2% of GDP on defense by 2024. In Vilnius, they will make 2% the minimum, but will not set any time frame for achieving that goal, NATO officials said. Under new estimates released Friday, only 11 of the allies will reach the 2% goal in 2023. But Secretary General Stoltenberg said that good progress is being made. He said in 2023, there will be a real increase of 8.3% across European allies and Canada. This is the biggest increase in decades. This is Washington Today. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, writes CBS News, in Beijing for meetings with top Chinese officials and American companies that do business in the country, said the U.S. welcomes healthy economic competition with China, but only if it's fair. Secretary Yellen also said she was concerned about new export controls announced by China on two critical minerals used in technologies like semiconductors. Secretary Yellen spoke at a roundtable with those U.S. business leaders.
During meetings with my counterparts, I'm communicating the concerns that I've heard from the U.S. business community, including China's use of non-market tools like expanded subsidies for its state-owned enterprises and domestic firms, as well as barriers to market access for foreign firms. I've been particularly troubled by punitive actions that have been taken against U.S. firms in recent months. I'm also concerned about new export controls recently announced by China on 2 critical minerals used in technologies like semiconductors. We're still evaluating the impact of these actions, but they remind us of the importance of building resilient and diversified supply chains. Our economic relationship with China must work for American businesses and American workers. I will always champion your interests and work to make sure there is a level playing field. This includes coordinating with our allies to respond to China's unfair economic practices. I also think that a shift toward market reforms would be in China's interests. A market-based approach helped spur rapid growth in China and helped lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It is a remarkable economic success story. Many of your firms understand how a level playing field can benefit both of our economies. China has an enormous and growing middle class with consumers who are eager to consume American goods and services. I've made clear that the United States does not seek a wholesale separation of our economies. We seek to diversify and not to decouple. A decoupling of the world's 2 largest economies would be destabilizing for the global economy, and it would be virtually impossible to undertake. I also made clear that actions we take to protect our national security are designed to be narrowly targeted, and that they are premised on straightforward national security considerations. They're not undertaken to gain economic advantage over China.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen in Beijing at a U.S. Business Roundtable during her meeting with the Chinese premier in the Great Hall of the People. She said, according to her prepared remarks, the United States will, in certain circumstances, need to pursue targeted actions to protect its national security. And we may disagree in these instances. We should not allow any disagreement to lead to misunderstandings that unnecessarily worsen our bilateral economic and financial relationship. Congressman Austin Scott, Republican from Georgia, was interviewed today by Fox Business about Secretary Yellen's visit to China.
The Chinese, they do not share our interests. They do not share our values. We cannot blame them for being smart. We need to blame ourselves for being naive to what they were doing all of these years, where they're creating a system where we in this country are more dependent on China than we've ever been for everything from our seed supply and chemical supply for our ag inputs to pharmaceutical supplies to now, because of the mandates for battery-operated vehicles, they have control over a large portion of our manufacturing raw materials. And so I think it's unfortunate that Janet Yellen is over there. She's an academic. I think she's naive enough to think that if you continue to feed the alligator, that the alligator won't eat you. But China doesn't share our interests or our values, and I'd much rather have the general that you had on the TV before over there negotiating with them instead of Secretary Yellen.
Congressman Austin Scott, Republican from Georgia, on the Fox Business Channel. U.S. jobs report from the Labor Department, 209,000 jobs created in June, unemployment rate falling from 3.7% to 3.6%. United Press International article says the jobs added are new hires in government, healthcare, and construction, and new hires should be a concern for a Federal Reserve working to slow the economy through successive rate hikes. President Biden at the White House saying the report is an example of his economic plan, Bidenomics, working.
But today's job shows that, jobs report shows that Bidenomics is working. We added 200,000 jobs, to 209,000 jobs last month. And all told, we've created over 13 million. I think it's 13,300,000. And 2.5 years, that's more than any president ever created in a 4-year term. And folks, the unemployment rate is below 4% for 17 straight months. Not since 1960 has that occurred. Inflation continues to fall. It's less than half of what it was a year ago. And the rate of Americans without health insurance is at an all-time low. Premiums are covered. Premiums for coverage of the Affordable Care Act are $800 less per person than before I took office. And that's Bidenomics.
President Biden at the White House. The National Republican Congressional Committee, or NRCC, which helps finance campaigns, put out a statement. It appears President Biden is well on his way to hiring the 87,000 new IRS agents being used to target middle-class families and small businesses after this morning's job report. The statement adding a tweet from Washington Post columnist Heather Long that has this: U.S. gained 209,000 jobs in June, but 30% of that was government jobs. Some industries did lay off. The NRCC statement continues, and to make matters worse, the number of people forced to take part-time work due to business conditions increased by 452,000 to 4.2 million. Bidenomics just means more government bureaucrats propped up by Democrats' reckless spending that fuels the inflation crisis. Meanwhile, people are forced to take part-time work just to put food on the table. Again, that statement from the National Republican Congressional Committee. On Wall Street today, the Dow down 187, NASDAQ down 18, S&P down 12. President Biden today also reversing a Trump administration order that had expanded short-term health insurance plans that do not cover as much as others. President Biden referring to these as junk plans, and he reduced the maximum duration from 3 years to 4 months, and also required more disclosure on coverage limits. Washington Today continues in a moment.
When citizens are truly informed, our republic thrives. Get informed straight from the source. On C-SPAN. Unfiltered, unbiased, word for word. From the nation's capital to wherever you are. Because the opinion that matters the most is your own. This is what democracy looks like. C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you find your podcasts. Now some of campaign 2024 from this week. Republicans running for president, events covered by C-SPAN. One of those candidates, former President Donald Trump, giving a speech in Council Bluffs, Iowa today. Iowa will hold the first Republican Party presidential caucuses in early 2024. Donald Trump criticizing another Republican candidate, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, for opposing a federal mandate for ethanol, which is a renewable fuel additive made from corn. Iowa produces the most of any state in the country. Associated Press writes, as a congressman from Florida, Ron DeSantis co-sponsored a bill in 2017 that would have immediately ended the renewable fuel standard, a position consistent with fiscal conservatives who see such mandates as government overreach. As a candidate, Donald Trump has promoted the executive order he signed as president, increasing the retail sale of fuel containing 15% ethanol. That from Associated Press. Here's Donald Trump today in Iowa.
Every Iowan also needs to know that Ron DeSantis totally despises Iowa ethanol and ethanol generally. He's been fighting for years. Don't forget, he was a congressman, and he was voting against it and fighting for years to kill every single job supported by this very important industry. Ending the renewable fuel standard was one of his top priorities as a member of Congress. He wanted to end it. And if he had his way, the entire economy of Iowa would absolutely collapse, because it would collapse if you did that. DeSantis slandered the ethanol mandate as, quote, socialism. He called it socialism, and called his vicious plan to annihilate the Iowa farming industry as a total no-brainer. Now he's going to come on here and probably say, I'm actually quite in favor of ethanol. I think it's wonderful. You know, one thing about a politician, I learned this long before I ran for office. When they have their initial thoughts, that's what they go back to. So he may have to come in and he may have to say, I love ethanol, isn't it wonderful? But what he's done to ethanol has been very bad. And the people in the ethanol industry understand it. He's bad news. In Florida, DeSantis is famous for his cruel targeting of family farms, not in favor of the farms. In a callous betrayal of farmers, DeSantis recently vetoed over $130 million in farm subsidies, prompting the Florida Agricultural Commissioner to state in total disbelief, this is no conceivable, and there is no conceivable reason to target agriculture in a year when we have billions and dollars and billions of reserves. Agriculture was harmed today by the governor of Florida, and harmed very badly, and it's true. And he's going to do that to Iowa and Nebraska and everybody else because that's his inclination. If you want to defend American farmers and grow more farm products in the USA, then you should vote for a very fine gentleman named Donald J. Trump.
Republican presidential candidate and former president Donald Trump today in Council Bluffs, Iowa. More from the Associated Press article. Recent history suggests a lack of support for ethanol may not be disqualifying. In 2016, Texas Senator Ted Cruz, who opposes the mandate, won Iowa's Republican caucuses, handing Donald Trump an early defeat in his ultimately successful White House campaign. Casey DeSantis, the wife of Republican presidential candidate Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, was in Johnston, Iowa on Thursday for the launch of a new group, Mamas for DeSantis.
But it was COVID that was really what led to a lot of this parental empowerment revolution, because for the first time, parents were peering into the classroom and they did not like what was being taught. They saw this sexualized curriculum being thrust in front of 5-year-olds. You saw what they were doing with women's sports, giving biological men the opportunity to take opportunities from women in athletics who have spent their entire life doing this. The governor passed something in Florida called curriculum transparency. Basically what that was, that enabled parents to be able to go to the schools to say, I want to see what kind of curriculum you're teaching our kids. And if they didn't give that information to the parent in a timely manner, they then had a right of action to be able to sue. And it was also tied to the principal's teaching certificate. And what that led to was the discovery of pornography in a lot of these schools, in their libraries. And a lot of parents were really frustrated. I talked to other parents across the state whose children were being transitioned behind their back without their consent or their knowledge. So far as there's a lady in Tallahassee, right where we live, January Littlejohn, and her daughter was being transitioned. They were changing her name behind her mother's back. They were asking her, you want to be called a boy or a girl? What bathroom do you want to use? And this isn't okay in this time in society. It's not okay to take the rights of parents away from them. And so that's why the governor and myself have stood strong. It also is safe communities too. When you look at defunding law enforcement, moms want to ensure that their kids can walk home from school safely. And if you're taking the resources away from the community and preventing that, that's a problem. So we have been able to mobilize a lot of moms, and I will say too, and I'm sure you heard this, Governor, when you were elected, don't rock the boat. Governor DeSantis, you live in a swing state. You only won by 0.4% in the first election, 32,000 votes in a state of 22 million. You try to do anything too bold, they're going to come after you. You're not going to win re-election. He rejected that. He led with principle, courage, and conviction. And like I said, he won by 1.5 million votes. But you know what? He won women by nearly 10 points, the first Republican governor in nearly 50 years to do that. He won more than 50% of single women.
Casey DeSantis, wife of Republican presidential candidate Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, in Johnston, Iowa on Thursday, along with Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds, who is also Republican. Kim Reynolds, though, says that she does not plan to endorse a Republican candidate for president in 2024. Casey DeSantis launching Mamas for DeSantis for the presidential race. She had a group by that name when her husband won re-election in Florida in 2022. Another Republican presidential candidate, North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum, was in Guilford, New Hampshire this week. New Hampshire will hold the first Republican presidential primary early next year. Governor Burgum is in his second term. He's a former software company CEO. After touring a machine shop owned by a local Republican official, he met with Republican activists, and one asked him why she should choose him.
So with so many people running in the Republican primary, What makes you different? Why should we vote for you instead of anyone else who's running?
Well, the first question, I want to just challenge the premise, because I hear this all the time, and I heard this before we announced, like, oh, it's such a crowded field, it's a crowded field, it's a crowded field. It's the most important job in the world, and at the time we announced, like 9 people had applied. And I'm like, when I was in the private sector, if we had the most important job in the company and we posted it, 9 people applied, the first thing we'd say is, well, we better repost. Particularly if some of the 9 people hadn't done the job or done anything like the job, or had never, in this case, some of the people have never created a private sector job or worked in the private sector. You know, like, okay, so what is the real pool for this job? It's not even as many as are announced. I mean, if you're really saying that's the qualifications for doing it. So I don't think, take a university in North Dakota, we post for the University of North Dakota, and everybody was delighted that we had 35 people apply for the job. I said, how many of them have been a university president before? They said, oh, like 3 of them. I said, well, that's interesting, because we've got a law school, a med school, and 12,000 students, and there's 10,000 universities in America, and only 100 of them have a law school, a med school, and more than 12,000 people. So the other 9,900 sitting presidents, only 3 of the other 9,900 sitting presidents want to apply for this job. Again, like, we didn't market, we didn't recruit. You know, so in this case, I'm sure there's hundreds of people that could actually do the job of president, and that I might look at them and say, hey, if they're running and they're going to win, I don't have to go do this. But there aren't, the good people that know how to do this work are not running, because the system is so brutal on families and on everybody else. They don't do it. So we said, hey, this field's not crowded. And when we started Great Plains, I went to the first trade show, and there were 64 accounting software companies in the trade show book. I thought there was going to be 10, so little miscalculation. You know, I bet the farm. I get there, we got this covered. Hey, but there turns out there's 6 times more competitors than we thought. Well, we started out and said we just have to tell our story. We got to do what we have to do. So competition, we're not afraid of. We think competition is good for the party. It's good for America, and it's good for getting results. But on the why, vote for us, people have to make their own decisions. If you think the issues that in our skill set, I mean, you think the issues of the economy and energy and national security, if you think improving the life of every American, unleashing the best of America, if that matters to you, then I would vote for us. If you say, hey, I want someone who's done the private sector jobs, that knows how to do this, that has a shot, that cares deeply about people and families, then we're the one. And then I can't describe why, let everybody else can make their pitch on why they think they would be the one to do it. But I think we've got what America needs right now, and we're putting it out there, and we're going to make sure everybody knows who we are. And we know that if we get this job, we will be able to do the job and do it well. That I know.
North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum, Republican presidential candidate, campaigning with his wife, Catherine, in Guilford, New Hampshire, on Wednesday. You can find the full events at cspan.org/campaign. There you will see 17 declared presidential candidates with C-SPAN coverage. Republicans, Democrats, and 1 Green Party candidate, Cornel West. The U.S. House and Senate are ending their second and final week of a district work period. They're back in session for legislative business next week. During the recess, the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Courts, Intellectual Property, and the Internet held a field hearing in Nashville, Tennessee, on the 5-year anniversary of the passage of the Music Modernization Act, which updated copyright law and licensing of music to reflect the technological switch to music consumed digitally. At that hearing, Congressman Gerald Nadler, Democrat from New York, asked the panel what new laws may be necessary to address the rise of artificial intelligence as applied to the music industry. The 6 witnesses are Abby North from North Music Group, Mike Molinar with Big Machine Music, Garrett Levin from Digital Media Association, Chris Arend from the Mechanical Licensing Collective, and 2 songwriters and producers, Daniel Tashin and David Porter.
New technologies like artificial intelligence can present great opportunities for creative industries to innovate, but they also present a set of challenges. Can you talk about how AI and other burgeoning technologies are affecting the music industry, and what do you think Congress can do to address these issues? We'll start with Ms. North.
Thank you for the question. I believe that there are tremendous opportunities with AI and for creators, for songwriters, for performers, but there also are deep, deep challenges, and there's the threat of decimating their careers. To me, the greatest challenge and maybe opportunity we have right now is to come up with a compensation model that's different from anything that's ever we've ever seen before. And what I mean is we all have works and sound recordings that are used in the ingestion to train these machine learning and AI generative tools. We need to make sure that not just the material, the IP, but the creators, that they're going to be paid for any derivative uses or any derivatives that are generated by this technology.
Mr. Molyneux?
Thank you. I think we need to prioritize human creators as we look at everything. AI is still early days, but it's moving fast. AI training should not be considered fair use, should not be presumptively considered fair use. I saw an operation that had spit out songs in the style of Songwriter Hall of Fame Liz Rose. In order to be able to write like her, the computer must have been fed her songs. That should not go on unlicensed, nor should it be uncompensated to Miss Rose. We need to make sure that where those examples happen, where that is considered infringement, and we need to preserve this direct licensing market.
Thank you, Mr. Levin.
Thanks for the question. It's such a massive topic right now, and obviously a top of mind for everyone in the industry. From the DEMA perspective, a lot of our focus is on what happens on the output side, less on the kind of input side of the training models, and ensuring that whatever rules are put into place and developed, that we make clear that there is an important data element to this. We've talked a lot about data on this panel already today, and the music industry has long struggled with metadata challenges. MLC is actually bringing a lot of improvement in that area. But one of the things that we hear talked about sometimes in AI is the idea that services like DEMA's members should somehow differentiate between AI-generated works and other works. I think absent information about what is AI generated, absent information about clear lines as between what truly counts as AI versus what counts as human, conversations that we're seeing at the Copyright Office around registrability, all of those things are fundamentally going to necessitate clear information that is available and included within the works as they arrive at the services. I think this is an ongoing conversation in the industry, and it's important that as we move forward that we're very clear about the elements of this massive topic that we're talking about and try to address them serially along that continuum.
Thank you, Mr. Tashian.
Yeah, I've been using AI for a long time. I mean, Cher's, do you believe in life after was a first sort of AI hit, because it asked the computer to specify what pitch she was on, which it did. It said, well, I think it should be, on this, which is an algorithm that's built into the Antares software. So AI's been, assisting musicians for decades, and now we're sort of kind of wringing our hands a little bit and saying, what do we do about it? But without taking too much time, I've yet to sort of experience an artwork created by a computer that gives me goosebumps or gives me chills because it's so beautiful. So until that happens, I'm just going to keep my head down and keep doing my best organic music and using computers when they can help.
Thank you, Mr. Porter.
I can only speak for creatives whose main emphasis is to try to do what they feel is a positive impact on the public at large about emotions that they don't know how to express through music, but these people do. And creatives don't want to have to try to figure out what the mechanics are that would be correct for the fairness that they should receive in doing what they do. They rely on others. That's why the relationships that they have with companies, people who say they're the business side of what they do. I think that the fact that if we cannot safeguard the fact that this process can compromise the future generations, their creative motivations to feel that it can be appreciated, respected, and done in a way that won't be compromised by someone else's interpretation of what they feel it should have been, then it can become extremely, in my opinion, risky to the value of what this whole process of AI can be, because you want to have the next generation motivated to want to take a path to do this, And if you have a method that compromises the real legitimacy of that based on what that creative feels, then you're doing something that's counter to what you may perceive as the good that it does. And
Thank you. My time has expired, but I ask the chair if you'd allow Mr. Aaron to answer the question.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Nadler. I will say briefly, I agree with the other witnesses. It's imperative that that we ensure that whatever technological developments come down the pipe, that we are always protecting the rights of the human creators that from which all these works originate. And certainly from our perspective, we see a growing correlation between the use of technologies and fraudulent activities. So I think it's important that Congress be monitoring that and to make sure that we have clear and stiff penalties in place for people who choose to use technology for fraudulent or other inappropriate purposes rather than to elevate creative works.
A U.S. House Judiciary Subcommittee field hearing on legal issues of copyright and licensing in the music industry, held in Nashville, Tennessee on July 27th. You can find the full video of the hearing, runs about 2 hours, at cspan.org. You heard a question from Congressman Gerald Nadler, Democrat from New York, and the witnesses, Abby North, president of the North Music Group, Michael Molinar, general manager of Big Machine Music, Garrett Levin, president and CEO of Digital Media Association, Chris Aaron, CEO of the Mechanical Licensing Collective, and 2 songwriters and producers, Daniel Tashian and David Porter. And thank you for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the stories Washington is talking about sent to your inbox every day. Subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night and weekend.